The courtroom on New Avalon was unlike any other building in the colony. It stood tall with walls made of reinforced glass that showed the purple sky outside. Inside, the air was cold and quiet. Captain Daniel Price sat at a long table on the left side of the room. His hands were folded in front of him, and his face showed no emotion. He wore his military uniform, dark blue with silver medals across his chest. Next to him sat Patricia Cole, his attorney. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. She kept reviewing documents on her datapad, occasionally whispering something to Daniel, who only nodded in response. On the right side of the courtroom sat Dr. Catherine Price. She was a beautiful woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were red from crying, but she sat straight and proud. Her attorney, Gregory Shaw, was a tall man with gray hair and an expensive suit. He looked confident, almost smug, as he organized his papers. But the real surprise in the courtroom was the woman sitting behind Daniel. Her name was Lyra, and she was not human. Her skin was a soft shade of blue that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Her eyes were large and crystalline, reflecting colors like a prism. She was Velocian, a member of an alien race that had recently joined the Galactic Coalition. She wore a simple white dress that flowed around her like water. Her presence caused whispers among the people in the courtroom. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with disgust. Judge Helen Morris entered the room and everyone stood. She was a woman in her late 60s with gray hair and a face that had seen too many sad stories. She wore the traditional black robes of a judge, and she carried herself with authority. She sat down at her bench and looked out at the courtroom. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Catherine to Lyra. She took a deep breath and then spoke. Her voice was clear and strong. She explained that this was a divorce proceeding between Daniel Price and Catherine Price. She noted that the case was unusual because of the presence of Lyra, who was identified as Daniel's romantic partner. She said that the court would examine the facts and make a decision based on both human law and the new interspecies regulations that had been established by the Galactic Coalition. Gregory Shaw stood up first. He began by painting a picture of Catherine as a devoted wife who had sacrificed everything for her husband. He talked about how she had waited for Daniel during his long military deployments. He described how she had supported his career even when it meant being alone for months at a time. He showed holographic images of their wedding day, a beautiful ceremony on Earth 20 years ago. Catherine had worn a white dress and Daniel had looked handsome in his dress uniform. They had promised to love each other forever, to be faithful, to honor their vows. Gregory's voice grew louder as he talked about betrayal. He said that Daniel had broken those sacred vows. He had engaged in an affair with an alien woman while still married to Catherine. He had dishonored not just his wife but also humanity itself. Patricia Cole objected. She said that Gregory was being dramatic and that the facts would show a different story. Judge Morris told Gregory to continue but to stick to the facts. Gregory nodded and then presented evidence. He showed messages between Daniel and Lyra. They were intimate, loving, and clearly romantic. He showed travel records that proved Daniel and Lyra had visited multiple colony worlds together. He showed photographs of them holding hands, laughing, sharing meals. Catherine looked away when the images appeared on the screens. Her jaw was tight and her hands gripped the edge of the table. When Gregory finished, Patricia Cole stood up. She was calm and composed. She thanked the judge and then began her defense of Daniel. She did not deny the affair. Instead, she argued that the marriage had been dead long before Lyra entered the picture. She presented evidence of her own. She showed communication logs between Daniel and Catherine from the past 10 years. The messages were cold and impersonal. Catherine rarely asked about Daniel's well-being. She sent short responses to his long messages. She declined invitations to military events, award ceremonies, and family gatherings. Patricia showed records proving that Catherine had spent 8 out of the last 10 years away from home, living on research stations and alien worlds. She had prioritized her career over her marriage. Patricia's voice was steady as she explained that Daniel had been lonely. He had been a good husband for many years, but he had received nothing in return. He had tried to save the marriage, but Catherine had been unwilling to make time for him. The affair with Lyra had happened after years of emotional neglect. Patricia argued that while the affair was technically a violation of the marriage contract, it was understandable given the circumstances. She said that Daniel deserved a chance at happiness. Judge Morris listened carefully. She made notes on her datapad and occasionally asked questions. She wanted to know specific dates, specific incidents, specific communications. Both attorneys provided answers. The courtroom remained silent except for their voices. Outside, the purple sky began to darken as the sun set. The lights in the courtroom grew brighter. Then Judge Morris did something unexpected. She asked Lyra to approach the bench. Lyra stood up slowly. She moved with grace, almost floating across the floor. She stood before the judge and waited. Judge Morris asked her if she understood why she was there. Lyra nodded. Her voice was soft and musical when she spoke through the translation device attached to her collar. She said that she understood this was a human legal proceeding. She said that she was willing to answer any questions. Judge Morris asked her if she knew that Daniel was married when their relationship began. Lyra paused. Then she said yes. She had known. But in her culture, marriage did not mean the same thing. Velocians believed in soul bonds, connections that went beyond physical presence or legal contracts. She believed that she and Daniel shared such a bond. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Gregory Shaw stood up and objected. He said that Velocian culture was irrelevant. This was a human divorce in a human court. Patricia Cole countered that the Galactic Coalition had established laws protecting interspecies relationships. Judge Morris raised her hand for silence. She said that both arguments had merit and that she would consider all perspectives. She announced that the trial would continue the next day. She dismissed the court. Everyone stood as she left the room. Daniel and Lyra walked out together. Catherine watched them go, her face unreadable. The second day of the trial began with heavy rain outside. The drops hit the glass walls of the courtroom like tiny drums. Daniel sat in the same place as before, his uniform perfectly pressed. Lyra sat behind him again, her blue skin looking paler in the gray light. Catherine arrived wearing a black suit. Her face was composed, but her eyes showed the sleepless night she had endured. Gregory Shaw looked ready for battle. He had a stack of files next to him and a determined expression. Patricia Cole appeared calm as always, sipping water from a glass. Judge Morris entered and everyone rose. She settled into her seat and immediately called the court to order. She looked at Gregory and told him to present his evidence. Gregory stood and thanked the judge. He walked to the center of the courtroom where a large holographic display stood. He activated it with a wave of his hand. The first image that appeared was a timeline. It showed the history of Daniel and Catherine's marriage. Gregory pointed to the early years. He showed records of their life together on Earth, then on Mars, then on New Avalon. He showed that they had been happy once. There were photos of them smiling, traveling, celebrating anniversaries. Then the timeline showed a shift. Catherine had been offered a prestigious research position studying alien plant life on a distant world called Terminus 7. She had accepted. The job required her to be away for 18 months. Gregory showed messages where Catherine had promised to return often, where she had assured Daniel that their marriage would survive the distance. But the visits became less frequent. The messages became shorter. Catherine became absorbed in her work. She made groundbreaking discoveries about alien ecosystems that could be used to terraform uninhabitable planets. She won awards. She became famous in scientific circles. But her marriage suffered. Gregory then showed the moment when Lyra entered Daniel's life. It was 7 years ago, not 2 as Daniel had initially claimed. Daniel had been assigned to lead a military delegation to the Velocian homeworld. The mission was to negotiate a treaty that would bring the Velocians into the human alliance. Lyra was the daughter of a high-ranking Velocian official. She had been assigned as a cultural liaison. Gregory showed surveillance footage from the delegation. It showed Daniel and Lyra talking, laughing, spending time together. At first, it seemed professional, but as weeks passed, their interactions became more intimate. They touched hands. They stood close. They looked at each other in ways that suggested more than friendship. Gregory's voice rose as he explained what this meant. Daniel had been in a position of power and authority. He had been representing humanity in delicate negotiations. His relationship with Lyra created a conflict of interest. What if the Velocians had used Lyra to manipulate him? What if Daniel had shared classified information? What if his judgment had been compromised? Gregory presented documents showing that Daniel had advocated strongly for terms that favored the Velocians. He suggested that Daniel's personal feelings had influenced his professional decisions. He called it a betrayal not just of Catherine but of humanity itself. Catherine was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high. Gregory asked her to describe her marriage. Catherine spoke in a clear voice. She said that she had loved Daniel with all her heart. She said that the distance had been difficult but necessary for her career. She had believed that Daniel understood and supported her ambitions. She had trusted him. When she discovered the affair, it had destroyed her. She described finding the messages by accident. She had been using Daniel's communication device to send a work email when she saw a notification from Lyra. The message was loving and intimate. Catherine had confronted Daniel, and he had admitted everything. But he had lied about how long it had been going on. He had said it was recent, that it meant nothing. Only later did Catherine discover the truth. Gregory asked Catherine how the betrayal had affected her. Catherine's voice broke slightly as she answered. She said that she had questioned everything. Had Daniel ever truly loved her? Had their entire marriage been a lie? She had thrown herself even deeper into her work to escape the pain. She had stopped eating properly. She had stopped sleeping. Her colleagues had noticed, but she had told them nothing. She had carried the humiliation alone. When she finally decided to file for divorce, Daniel had brought Lyra to the proceedings. The disrespect was overwhelming. Patricia Cole cross-examined Catherine. She was gentle but firm. She asked Catherine how many days she had spent with Daniel in the past 10 years. Catherine hesitated. She admitted it was not many. Patricia showed records proving that Catherine had been physically present with Daniel for less than 6 months total over a decade. Patricia asked if Catherine had ever suggested marriage counseling. Catherine said no. She had thought they could work through it on their own. Patricia asked if Catherine had ever considered that Daniel might be lonely. Catherine's face hardened. She said that loneliness was not an excuse for infidelity. Patricia then presented her own evidence. She showed messages where Catherine had dismissed Daniel's requests for her to visit. She showed incidents where Catherine had prioritized work events over important moments in Daniel's life. His promotion ceremony, his birthday, the anniversary of a battle where he had lost close friends. Catherine had been absent for all of them. Patricia argued that Catherine had abandoned the marriage long before Daniel had. She suggested that Catherine's outrage was hypocritical. She wanted the benefits of being married to a war hero without fulfilling her responsibilities as a wife. Judge Morris intervened. She said that both sides were making valid points, but that blame was not the only consideration. She wanted to understand the full picture. She asked Daniel to testify. Daniel stood and walked to the witness stand. He looked tired. His voice was quiet when he spoke. He said that he had loved Catherine deeply. He still did in a way, but the years of separation had been unbearable. He had tried to be understanding. He had tried to support her career. But he had felt abandoned. When he met Lyra, it had been unexpected. She had shown him kindness and attention that he had not received from Catherine in years. He had not planned to fall in love with her, but it had happened. Daniel admitted that he had made mistakes. He should have been honest with Catherine sooner. He should have asked for a divorce before beginning a relationship with Lyra, but he had been afraid. He had hoped that somehow things would work out, that Catherine would come home and they could fix their marriage. It had been foolish. He took full responsibility for the pain he had caused. But he also insisted that the marriage had been broken long before Lyra. He said that Catherine had chosen her career over him repeatedly. He had simply done the same by choosing happiness with someone who actually wanted to be with him. The courtroom was silent when Daniel finished. Judge Morris looked at all the evidence, all the testimonies. She announced that she would hear from Lyra next. She wanted to understand the Velosian perspective before making any decisions. The court would reconvene after a short recess. As people filed out, Daniel and Lyra left together. Catherine remained seated, staring at nothing. After the recess, the courtroom filled again. The rain had stopped and pale sunlight filtered through the glass walls. Gregory Shaw stood as soon as Judge Morris called the session back to order. He said he had additional evidence that would change everything. Judge Morris gave him permission to proceed. Gregory activated the holographic display again. This time, classified documents appeared. They were marked with high-level security clearances. Gregory explained that he had obtained special permission from the Colonial Authority to present these documents. They proved something damaging about Daniel's relationship with Lyra. The documents showed that Daniel had been involved with Lyra for 7 years, not the timeline that had been previously discussed. But more importantly, the affair had begun during the final negotiations of the Velocian Treaty. Gregory pointed to specific dates. Daniel had been leading the human delegation. Lyra had been the cultural liaison. Their relationship had started in the middle of talks that would determine the future of human-Velocian relations. Gregory argued that this was more than just an affair. It was a security risk. Daniel had access to classified information about human military capabilities, colony locations, and strategic plans. His relationship with Lyra, the daughter of a Velocian official, created a vulnerability that could have been exploited. Gregory presented communications between Daniel and Lyra from that time period. Some messages referenced the negotiations. In one message, Daniel had told Lyra about human concerns regarding Velocian mining operations near a human colony. In another, he had mentioned troop movements that were supposed to be confidential. Gregory's voice was sharp as he explained that Daniel had shared sensitive information with someone he was romantically involved with. Whether Lyra had used that information or not was irrelevant. The fact that Daniel had compromised security protocols was undeniable. Patricia Cole objected immediately. She said that the messages were being taken out of context. She argued that Daniel had never shared anything that truly endangered human interests. She demanded to see the full context of each communication. Judge Morris agreed. She ordered both attorneys to submit complete records for her review. But Gregory had made his point. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Lyra's crystalline eyes showed something that might have been concern. Gregory was not finished. He called a witness, a military intelligence officer named Commander Frank Hayes. Hayes was a stern man in his 40s with a shaved head and a rigid posture. He testified that he had been part of the security detail during the Velocian negotiations. He said that he had noticed Daniel's relationship with Lyra developing. He had reported his concerns to his superiors, but they had been dismissed. The negotiations were too important and Daniel was too valuable. Hayes said that he believed Daniel's judgment had been compromised. He pointed to several decisions Daniel had made that favored Velocian interests over human ones. Patricia cross-examined Hayes. She asked if any actual harm had come from Daniel's decisions. Hayes admitted that the treaty had been beneficial for both sides. She asked if there was any evidence that Daniel had been manipulated or coerced. Hayes said no, but that did not mean the risk had not been real. Patricia asked if Hayes had personal feelings about interspecies relationships. Hayes hesitated. He admitted that he found them unnatural and problematic. Patricia suggested that his testimony was biased. Hayes insisted it was not. Judge Morris took notes throughout the exchange. When Hayes was dismissed, she turned to Gregory and asked if he had more witnesses. Gregory said yes. He called Catherine back to the stand. This time, Catherine's testimony was different. Gregory asked her to describe what her life had been like after discovering the affair. Catherine's voice was steady but filled with emotion. She said that she had felt like her world had collapsed. She had always believed that despite the distance, despite the time apart, she and Daniel had something solid. They had made vows. They had promised to be faithful. She had never doubted him. When she learned about Lyra, everything changed. She had confronted Daniel, and he had admitted to the affair but had lied about its duration. He had said it was recent, a mistake, something that meant nothing. Catherine had wanted to believe him. She had wanted to save their marriage. But as she investigated, she discovered the truth. The affair had lasted years. Daniel had been living a double life, spending time with Lyra while pretending to be committed to Catherine. The betrayal was complete. Catherine described how she had tried to continue her work but could not focus. She had made mistakes in her research, something that had never happened before. She had withdrawn from her colleagues. She had stopped attending conferences. Her reputation, built over decades of hard work, had begun to suffer. All because of Daniel's choices. Gregory asked Catherine what she wanted from this divorce. Catherine looked directly at Daniel. She said she wanted him to face the consequences of his actions. She wanted the court to recognize that what he had done was not just a personal failing, but a professional one. She wanted a settlement that reflected the damage he had caused to her life and career. Then Catherine did something unexpected. She turned to Lyra and addressed her directly. She said that she understood Velocian culture might be different, but Daniel was human. He had made promises under human law, in a human ceremony before human witnesses. Those promises meant something. They were supposed to mean everything. By entering into a relationship with a married man, Lyra had participated in breaking those vows. Whether she intended harm or not, harm had been done. Catherine said she did not hate Lyra, but she could never forgive her either. The courtroom was completely silent. Lyra's expression was difficult to read, but her crystalline eyes seemed to reflect sadness. Gregory thanked Catherine and then rested his case. He had presented a picture of Daniel as a man who had betrayed his wife, compromised his professional integrity, and dishonored his vows. He had painted Lyra as a willing participant in that betrayal, regardless of cultural differences, and he had shown Catherine as a victim who deserved justice. Judge Morris called for another recess. She needed time to review all the evidence before allowing the defense to present their full case. As people left the courtroom, Catherine remained in her seat for a long moment. She looked exhausted but also relieved. She had said everything she needed to say. Now it was up to the judge to decide. Daniel and Lyra left quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The weight of Catherine's words hung in the air like a physical presence. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the city of New Avalon. When the trial resumed, Judge Morris made an announcement. She said that in the interest of fairness and understanding, she was going to allow Lyra to testify fully about her perspective and her culture. Gregory Shaw objected immediately. He argued that Velocian culture was irrelevant to a human divorce proceeding. Patricia Cole countered that the Galactic Coalition had established laws protecting interspecies relationships, and that those laws required consideration of cultural differences. Judge Morris sided with Patricia. She said that this case had implications beyond just Daniel and Catherine. It would set precedents for how humanity dealt with interspecies relationships in the future. Therefore, all perspectives needed to be heard. Lyra was called to the witness stand. She moved gracefully across the courtroom, her blue skin shimmering under the lights. She sat down, and the translation device around her neck hummed softly. Judge Morris asked her to explain Velocian culture regarding relationships and marriage. Lyra's voice was soft and musical, even through the mechanical translation. She began by explaining that Velocians did not view love as a finite resource. In their culture, it was entirely possible and even encouraged to love multiple people simultaneously. The concept of exclusivity in romantic relationships was foreign to them. Lyra explained that Velocians believed in soul bonds, deep connections between individuals that transcended physical presence or legal contracts. These bonds could form between any two beings, regardless of species, gender, or existing relationships. When a Velocian felt such a bond, it was considered wrong to deny it or suppress it. To do so would be to reject a fundamental part of oneself. Lyra said that when she met Daniel, she had felt such a bond immediately. It was not something she chose or planned. It simply was. She explained that in Velocian culture, if Daniel had been Velocian, the proper course of action would have been to introduce Lyra to Catherine and attempt to form a harmonious relationship between all three of them. Velocians often lived in family groups that included multiple romantic partners, all caring for each other and any children equally. There was no jealousy, no sense of ownership, no betrayal, just love in its many forms. Judge Morris asked Lyra if she had known that human culture was different. Lyra paused. She said yes, she had known that humans typically practiced monogamous relationships, but she had not fully understood the depth of emotion and commitment that human marriage vows represented. In her mind, Daniel's marriage to Catherine was a legal arrangement, not a soul bond. She had believed that Daniel could honor his legal obligations to Catherine while still having a meaningful relationship with her. She had never intended to cause harm. Gregory Shaw stood to cross-examine. He asked Lyra if she had ever asked Daniel to leave Catherine. Lyra said no. She had never made such a demand. In fact, she had encouraged Daniel to maintain his relationship with Catherine. She had suggested multiple times that the three of them meet and discuss their situation. Gregory asked if Lyra had known that Catherine would find such a suggestion insulting. Lyra admitted that she had learned this only after Catherine refused to meet with her. Gregory then asked about the classified information that Daniel had shared with Lyra. Had she reported any of it to her father or other Velocian officials? Lyra's expression showed surprise. She said no, absolutely not. The conversations she had with Daniel were personal and private. She had never used any information he shared for political or military purposes. Gregory pressed her. How could the court believe that? How could anyone trust that she had not passed information to her government? Lyra looked directly at Gregory. She said that in Velocian culture, betraying a soul bond was the worst possible crime. It would result in permanent exile from Velocian society. She would never risk such a fate. Patricia Cole took over the questioning. She asked Lyra to describe her relationship with Daniel. Lyra spoke about the early days when they had met during the negotiations. She described feeling an immediate connection. They had talked for hours about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Daniel had told her about his loneliness, about feeling forgotten by Catherine. Lyra had offered companionship and understanding. As time passed, their connection deepened. They fell in love. Patricia asked Lyra if she had ever encouraged Daniel to repair his marriage. Lyra said yes many times. She showed messages she had sent to Daniel over the years. In them, she encouraged him to communicate with Catherine, to spend more time with her, to be honest about his feelings. She had told him that if he truly wanted to stay married, he needed to make Catherine a priority. But Daniel had said that Catherine was not interested in saving the marriage. She was too focused on her career. Lyra had believed him. Then Lyra revealed something that shocked the courtroom. 2 years ago, she had reached out to Catherine directly. She had sent a message through official diplomatic channels requesting a meeting. Lyra had wanted to explain her perspective and to see if there was a way for all three of them to find peace. The message had been respectful and sincere. Catherine had responded with a single sentence. She had called the suggestion an insult and had refused any further communication. Lyra had respected that decision, but it had saddened her. She had hoped that Catherine might be willing to understand. Patricia presented the message as evidence. The courtroom saw Catherine's harsh response. Some people looked at Catherine with sympathy, others with judgment. Catherine's face showed no emotion, but her hands gripped the table. Gregory objected. He said that Catherine had every right to refuse such a meeting. The suggestion itself was offensive given the circumstances. Patricia agreed that Catherine had the right to refuse. But the evidence showed that Lyra had made an effort to address the situation honorably within her cultural framework. Judge Morris asked Lyra a direct question. Did she regret her relationship with Daniel? Lyra thought for a long moment. Then she answered honestly. She said that she regretted the pain that Catherine had experienced. She regretted that human and Velocian cultures were so different, that understanding seemed impossible. But she did not regret loving Daniel. She could not regret a soul bond. It would be like regretting her own existence. However, she acknowledged that if she had understood human marriage better from the beginning, she might have handled things differently. She might have been more insistent that Daniel resolve his marriage before they became romantically involved. Patricia asked one final question. What did Lyra want from this trial? Lyra looked at Daniel, then at Catherine, then at Judge Morris. She said that she wanted Daniel to be free to make his own choices. She wanted Catherine to find peace and healing, and she wanted the court to recognize that love between species was not inherently wrong. Even when it created complications, she believed that humanity's future among the stars would require understanding and accepting different perspectives on relationships. This case could be a step toward that understanding or a step backward. She hoped for the former. When Lyra stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was filled with mixed emotions. Some people saw her as a homewrecker who had destroyed a marriage. Others saw her as a sincere individual caught in a cultural conflict. Judge Morris looked thoughtful. She announced that she needed time to review all the testimony and evidence. The trial would resume the following day for closing arguments and then her verdict. The court was dismissed. As people filed out, Daniel approached Lyra and took her hand. Catherine watched them leave together, her expression unreadable. Judge Morris began by inviting the attorneys to present their closing arguments. Gregory Shaw stood first. He walked to the center of the courtroom with confidence. His voice was strong and clear as he summarized his case. He reminded the court that this was fundamentally about broken vows and betrayal. Daniel Price had made a sacred promise to Catherine 20 years ago. He had promised to be faithful, to honor their marriage, to forsake all others. He had broken that promise repeatedly over 7 years. Gregory argued that cultural differences were not an excuse. Daniel was human. He understood human marriage. He knew what his vows meant. When he chose to engage in a relationship with Lyra, he made a conscious decision to betray his wife. The fact that Velocian culture accepted non-exclusive relationships was irrelevant. Daniel had not married a Velocian. He had married a human under human law. Gregory's voice grew passionate as he described the pain Catherine had endured. She had trusted her husband completely. She had believed in their marriage. That trust had been shattered. Gregory also emphasized the security concerns. He acknowledged that no direct harm had been proven, but the risk had been real. Daniel had compromised his professional integrity by sharing information with someone he was romantically involved with. That showed poor judgment at best and dangerous recklessness at worst. Gregory concluded by asking the court to grant Catherine a substantial settlement. She deserved compensation for the emotional damage, the professional setbacks, and the years of her life that had been wasted on a man who did not value her. When Gregory sat down, Patricia Cole stood. Her approach was calmer, more measured. She began by acknowledging that Daniel had made mistakes. She did not deny the affair or try to minimize its impact, but she argued that the court needed to see the full picture. This marriage had been failing for years before Lyra entered the scene. Catherine had been absent emotionally and physically. She had chosen her career over her husband repeatedly. That was her right, but it had consequences. Patricia presented evidence again of Catherine's absences, her cold communications, her refusals to attend important events in Daniel's life. She argued that a marriage could not survive on vows alone. It required presence, effort, and mutual commitment. Catherine had not provided those things. Daniel had been lonely, neglected, and emotionally abandoned. When he met Lyra, he found someone who actually wanted to spend time with him, who cared about his feelings, who made him happy. Was it wrong? By the strict letter of the law, yes. But was it understandable? Patricia believed it was. Patricia also addressed the cultural issue. She argued that the Galactic Coalition's laws protecting interspecies relationships needed to be taken seriously. Lyra had acted in good faith according to her cultural understanding. She had not set out to destroy a marriage. She had genuinely believed that her relationship with Daniel was acceptable. Punishing her for cultural differences would send a message that humanity was closed-minded and unwilling to adapt to a multi-species society. Patricia concluded by asking the court to recognize that this was a complex situation with no clear villains. She requested a fair division of assets and the freedom for Daniel to move forward with his life. Judge Morris listened carefully to both arguments. When Patricia finished, Morris thanked both attorneys. Then she announced that she was ready to deliver her verdict. The courtroom became completely silent. Every person leaned forward, waiting. Morris took a deep breath and began. She started by addressing the fundamental legal question. Did Daniel Price violate his marriage contract with Catherine Price? Morris stated clearly and unequivocally that yes, he did. Under human law, marriage was a binding contract that required fidelity unless otherwise specified in the contract itself. Daniel and Catherine's marriage contract contained no exceptions for interspecies relationships or cultural differences. Therefore, Daniel had committed adultery, and Catherine had full legal grounds for divorce. Morris paused to let that sink in. Catherine's face showed relief. Gregory nodded with satisfaction. Daniel looked down at the table. But Morris was not finished. She continued by saying that while Daniel had violated the contract, the court also needed to recognize the context. The evidence showed clearly that the marriage had been deteriorating for years. Both parties had contributed to its failure. Catherine's prolonged absences and emotional distance had created a situation where the marriage existed only on paper. A marriage required more than just avoiding infidelity. It required active participation and effort. Morris stated that the law recognized irreconcilable differences as grounds for divorce. Even without the affair, this marriage would likely have ended eventually. The affair accelerated the timeline and added pain to an already difficult situation, but it was not the sole cause of the marriage's failure. Catherine had been right to feel betrayed, but she also needed to acknowledge her own role in the breakdown. Then Morris addressed the security concerns that Gregory had raised. She stated that she had reviewed all classified documents with military intelligence officials. She had consulted experts and examined the evidence thoroughly. Her conclusion was that while Daniel had shared information with Lyra, it did not constitute a security breach or treason. The information shared was relatively minor and would have become public knowledge eventually. There was no evidence that Lyra had used any information for political or military purposes. There was no evidence that Daniel's decisions during the Velocian negotiations had been compromised by his relationship. Morris acknowledged that the appearance of impropriety was concerning. Daniel should have been more careful about maintaining professional boundaries during sensitive negotiations. But appearance and reality were different things. The facts showed that no actual harm had been done to human interests. Therefore, Morris was ruling that the affair, while a violation of the marriage contract, did not constitute treason or a conflict of interest that endangered humanity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Gregory looked frustrated. He had hoped the security angle would strengthen Catherine's case significantly. Patricia looked satisfied but cautious. She knew there was more to come. Morris raised her hand for silence. She said she was not finished with her verdict. She still needed to address the settlement and other matters. Morris stated that in typical divorce cases, assets were divided and sometimes spousal support was awarded based on various factors including length of marriage, contributions of each party, and financial situations. This case was not typical, but the same principles applied. Morris acknowledged Catherine's contributions to the marriage and to society. Her xenobiological research had saved lives and advanced human knowledge. She deserved recognition and fair compensation. However, Morris also noted that Catherine had profited enormously from her career. She had earned substantial income, won prestigious awards, and gained international fame. She was not a dependent spouse who had sacrificed her own prospects for her husband's career. She was an independent, successful professional in her own right. Daniel had also made significant contributions. He had fought in wars, protected human colonies, and earned his military benefits through service and sacrifice. Morris announced her decision on asset division. The properties that Daniel and Catherine owned jointly on New Avalon would be divided, with Catherine receiving 60% and Daniel receiving 40%. This reflected Catherine's intention to remain on New Avalon and continue her research there, as well as acknowledging that the affair had caused her additional hardship. Daniel would retain his military pension and benefits, which he had earned through his service. Catherine would retain all income and assets from her research career. There would be no spousal support in either direction. Both parties were financially independent and capable of supporting themselves. The marriage had lasted 20 years, but for most of those years the parties had lived essentially separate lives. Morris believed that a clean financial break was most appropriate. The courtroom absorbed this information. Catherine looked somewhat disappointed. She had hoped for a larger settlement. Daniel looked relieved. He had feared losing his military benefits. Judge Morris continued her verdict. She said that asset division was only part of the picture. This case had revealed deeper issues that went beyond property and money. It had exposed a fundamental gap in how humanity was handling relationships in a multi-species society. The Galactic Coalition had established laws protecting interspecies relationships, but those laws were vague about how to handle conflicts between different cultural norms. This case provided an opportunity to establish clearer guidelines. Morris stated that she was issuing an unusual order. She was requiring both Daniel and Catherine to attend mandatory interspecies cultural counseling, not as a couple but as individuals. The counseling would be conducted by certified professionals who specialized in helping humans understand and navigate alien cultures. Morris explained her reasoning. Catherine needed to understand that humanity's future involved regular interaction with species that had very different values and customs. Her reaction to Lyra had been understandable from a human perspective, but it also showed a lack of cultural awareness that could cause problems in the future. Daniel needed counseling for different reasons. He had engaged in a relationship with someone from another species without fully understanding the implications. He had failed to properly educate himself about Velocian culture before getting involved with Lyra. He had also failed to address his failing marriage before seeking happiness elsewhere. The counseling would help him navigate future relationships, whether with humans or aliens, in a more thoughtful and responsible way. The courtroom reacted with surprise. This was unprecedented. Judges did not typically order counseling in divorce cases unless children were involved, or there had been abuse. Gregory Shaw stood to object. He argued that Catherine was the victim in this case and should not be punished with mandatory counseling. Patricia Cole also looked uncertain about this development. Morris overruled the objection. She stated firmly that this was not punishment. It was education. The goal was not to blame either party but to help them grow and adapt to the reality of living in a multi-species society. Morris explained that humanity's success in the galaxy depended on the ability to understand and respect different cultures. This divorce had revealed prejudices and misunderstandings on all sides. The counseling requirement was meant to prevent similar situations in the future. It was meant to help humans become better citizens of the Galactic Coalition. Morris stated that the counseling would last for 6 months, with weekly sessions. Both Daniel and Catherine would be required to complete it before the divorce could be finalized. Then Morris turned her attention to Lyra. She addressed the Velosian woman directly. Morris stated that under Galactic Coalition law, Lyra had done nothing illegal. Interspecies relationships were protected. Lyra had not violated any laws of her own species. She had not coerced or manipulated Daniel. She had acted according to her cultural understanding of relationships. However, Morris continued, ignorance was not a complete defense. Lyra had chosen to be with a married human. She may not have fully understood what that meant, but she had a responsibility to learn. Morris announced that Lyra would also be required to attend the cultural counseling sessions. She needed to understand human concepts of marriage, fidelity, and the emotional weight that humans placed on exclusive romantic relationships. If Lyra planned to continue living among humans and maintaining a relationship with Daniel, she needed this understanding. Morris emphasized that this was not a punishment. Lyra had shown good faith throughout the proceedings. She had been honest and respectful. But good intentions were not enough when cultures collided. Education was necessary. The courtroom buzzed with reactions. Some people thought Morris was being too lenient on Lyra. Others thought she was being too harsh on Catherine and Daniel by requiring counseling. Morris allowed the noise for a moment, then called for silence. She said she had one more announcement to make, and it was the most important one. Morris stated that she was making a formal recommendation to the Galactic Coalition Council. She recommended that all interspecies relationships involving legally married individuals from species with exclusivity-based marriage systems must include mandatory disclosure and mediation. If a Velosian wanted to date a married human, there should be a formal process. The married individual would be required to disclose their marriage status. The potential partner would be required to complete cultural education about what that marriage meant. Mediation would be offered to all parties involved. Morris explained that this recommendation was based on the belief that most conflicts could be prevented through better communication and understanding. If such a system had been in place, Daniel, Catherine, and Lyra might have avoided years of pain. They might have found a peaceful resolution. Or Daniel and Catherine might have divorced earlier before the affair, allowing everyone to move forward with less hurt. The current system failed to provide adequate support for navigating these complex situations. Morris acknowledged that her recommendation was just that, a recommendation. The Galactic Coalition Council would decide whether to adopt it, but she hoped they would seriously consider it. She stated that this case should never have reached this point. The pain, the betrayal, and the misunderstanding were all preventable with the right systems in place. Morris looked at Daniel, Catherine, and Lyra. She said that none of them were bad people. They were simply people trying to find happiness in a complicated universe. They had made mistakes, but those mistakes could teach valuable lessons. Morris then addressed the court as a whole. She said that humanity was living in a new era. Humans were no longer alone in the universe. They shared planets, space stations, and even romantic relationships with dozens of alien species. Each species brought different values, different customs, and different ways of understanding love and commitment. Learning to navigate those differences was one of the greatest challenges humanity faced. This case was a small example of that larger challenge. Morris stated that her verdict was designed to be fair to all parties while also promoting understanding and growth. Catherine would receive a fair settlement and the divorce she requested. Daniel would be free to move forward with his life. Lyra would not be vilified for cultural differences. And all three would receive the education they needed to better navigate their futures. Morris believed this was the best outcome possible given the circumstances. She asked if there were any questions about the verdict. Gregory Shaw stood and asked when the counseling would begin. Morris said that arrangements would be made within the next 2 weeks. All three parties would be contacted with schedules and locations. Patricia Cole asked if the divorce would be legally finalized before or after the counseling. Morris stated that the divorce would be granted immediately, but certain aspects of the settlement would not be executed until the counseling was completed. This ensured compliance. Lyra raised her hand and asked through her translator if she could speak. Morris gave her permission. Lyra stood and thanked the judge for her fairness and wisdom. She said that she had learned much from this experience and looked forward to the counseling. She hoped that it would help her better understand the human heart. Catherine looked at Lyra with an expression that was hard to read. It was not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. Daniel also stood. He thanked the judge and apologized to Catherine. He said that he had never meant to cause such pain. He acknowledged his mistakes and promised to learn from them. Catherine did not respond, but her eyes were wet with tears. The courtroom was silent, filled with the weight of emotions that had been building throughout the trial. Judge Morris announced that the court was adjourned. The divorce of Daniel Price and Catherine Price was granted. Everyone stood as Morris left the courtroom. The trial was over. Judge Morris began by inviting the attorneys to present their closing arguments. Gregory Shaw stood first. He walked to the center of the courtroom with confidence. His voice was strong and clear as he summarized his case. He reminded the court that this was fundamentally about broken vows and betrayal. Daniel Price had made a sacred promise to Catherine 20 years ago. He had promised to be faithful, to honor their marriage, to forsake all others. He had broken that promise repeatedly over 7 years. Gregory argued that cultural differences were not an excuse. Daniel was human. He understood human marriage. He knew what his vows meant. When he chose to engage in a relationship with Lyra, he made a conscious decision to betray his wife. The fact that Volosian culture accepted non-exclusive relationships was irrelevant. Daniel had not married a Volosian. He had married a human under human law. Gregory's voice grew passionate as he described the pain Catherine had endured. She had trusted her husband completely. She had believed in their marriage. That trust had been shattered. Gregory also emphasized the security concerns. He acknowledged that no direct harm had been proven, but the risk had been real. Daniel had compromised his professional integrity by sharing information with someone he was romantically involved with. That showed poor judgment at best and dangerous recklessness at worst. Gregory concluded by asking the court to grant Catherine a substantial settlement. She deserved compensation for the emotional damage, the professional setbacks, and the years of her life that had been wasted on a man who did not value her. When Gregory sat down, Patricia Cole stood. Her approach was calmer, more measured. She began by acknowledging that Daniel had made mistakes. She did not deny the affair or try to minimize its impact, but she argued that the court needed to see the full picture. This marriage had been failing for years before Lyra entered the scene. Catherine had been absent emotionally and physically. She had chosen her career over her husband repeatedly. That was her right, but it had consequences. Patricia presented evidence again of Catherine's absences, her cold communications, her refusals to attend important events in Daniel's life. She argued that a marriage could not survive on vows alone. It required presence, effort, and mutual commitment. Catherine had not provided those things. Daniel had been lonely, neglected, and emotionally abandoned. When he met Lyra, he found someone who actually wanted to spend time with him, who cared about his feelings, who made him happy. Was it wrong? By the strict letter of the law, yes. But was it understandable? Patricia believed it was. Patricia also addressed the cultural issue. She argued that the Galactic Coalition's laws protecting interspecies relationships needed to be taken seriously. Lyra had acted in good faith according to her cultural understanding. She had not set out to destroy a marriage. She had genuinely believed that her relationship with Daniel was acceptable. Punishing her for cultural differences would send a message that humanity was closed-minded and unwilling to adapt to a multi-species society. Patricia concluded by asking the court to recognize that this was a complex situation with no clear villains. She requested a fair division of assets and the freedom for Daniel to move forward with his life. Judge Morris listened carefully to both arguments. When Patricia finished, Morris thanked both attorneys. Then she announced that she was ready to deliver her verdict. The courtroom became completely silent. Every person leaned forward, waiting. Morris took a deep breath and began. She started by addressing the fundamental legal question. Did Daniel Price violate his marriage contract with Catherine Price? Morris stated clearly and unequivocally that yes, he did. Under human law, marriage was a binding contract that required fidelity unless otherwise specified in the contract itself. Daniel and Catherine's marriage contract contained no exceptions for interspecies relationships or cultural differences. Therefore, Daniel had committed adultery, and Catherine had full legal grounds for divorce. Morris paused to let that sink in. Catherine's face showed relief. Gregory nodded with satisfaction. Daniel looked down at the table. But Morris was not finished. She continued by saying that while Daniel had violated the contract, the court also needed to recognize the context. The evidence showed clearly that the marriage had been deteriorating for years. Both parties had contributed to its failure. Catherine's prolonged absences and emotional distance had created a situation where the marriage existed only on paper. A marriage required more than just avoiding infidelity. It required active participation and effort. Morris stated that the law recognized irreconcilable differences as grounds for divorce. Even without the affair, this marriage would likely have ended eventually. The affair accelerated the timeline and added pain to an already difficult situation, but it was not the sole cause of the marriage's failure. Catherine had been right to feel betrayed, but she also needed to acknowledge her own role in the breakdown. Then Morris addressed the security concerns that Gregory had raised. She stated that she had reviewed all classified documents with military intelligence officials. She had consulted experts and examined the evidence thoroughly. Her conclusion was that while Daniel had shared information with Lyra, it did not constitute a security breach or treason. The information shared was relatively minor and would have become public knowledge eventually. There was no evidence that Lyra had used any information for political or military purposes. There was no evidence that Daniel's decisions during the Voloshin negotiations had been compromised by his relationship. Morris acknowledged that the appearance of impropriety was concerning. Daniel should have been more careful about maintaining professional boundaries during sensitive negotiations. But appearance and reality were different things. The facts showed that no actual harm had been done to human interests. Therefore, Morris was ruling that the affair, while a violation of the marriage contract, did not constitute treason or a conflict of interest that endangered humanity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Gregory looked frustrated. He had hoped the security angle would strengthen Catherine's case significantly. Patricia looked satisfied but cautious. She knew there was more to come. Morris raised her hand for silence. She said she was not finished with her verdict. She still needed to address the settlement and other matters. Morris stated that in typical divorce cases, assets were divided and sometimes spousal support was awarded based on various factors including length of marriage, contributions of each party, and financial situations. This case was not typical, but the same principles applied. Morris acknowledged Catherine's contributions to the marriage and to society. Her xenobiological research had saved lives and advanced human knowledge. She deserved recognition and fair compensation. However, Morris also noted that Catherine had profited enormously from her career. She had earned substantial income, won prestigious awards, and gained international fame. She was not a dependent spouse who had sacrificed her own prospects for her husband's career. She was an independent, successful professional in her own right. Daniel had also made significant contributions. He had fought in wars, protected human colonies, and earned his military benefits through service and sacrifice. Morris announced her decision on asset division. The properties that Daniel and Catherine owned jointly on New Avalon would be divided, with Catherine receiving 60% and Daniel receiving 40%. This reflected Catherine's intention to remain on New Avalon and continue her research there, as well as acknowledging that the affair had caused her additional hardship. Daniel would retain his military pension and benefits which he had earned through his service. Catherine would retain all income and assets from her research career. There would be no spousal support in either direction. Both parties were financially independent and capable of supporting themselves. The marriage had lasted 20 years, but for most of those years the parties had lived essentially separate lives. Morris believed that a clean financial break was most appropriate. The courtroom absorbed this information. Catherine looked somewhat disappointed. She had hoped for a larger settlement. Daniel looked relieved. He had feared losing his military benefits. The courtroom began to empty slowly. People stood in small groups discussing the verdict in hushed voices. News reporters rushed out to file their stories. This case would dominate headlines across human space for weeks. Some praised Judge Morris for her balanced approach. Others criticized her for being too lenient on Daniel and Lyra, or too harsh on Catherine. Everyone agreed that the verdict was unexpected and would have lasting implications. Catherine remained seated at her table for several minutes after Judge Morris left. Gregory Shaw sat beside her, reviewing the settlement details on his datapad. He told Catherine that while the verdict was not everything they had hoped for, it was still favorable. She would receive the majority of their shared property, and her reputation would remain intact. The mandatory counseling was unusual, but it was only 6 months. Catherine nodded but said nothing. She felt numb. The divorce was granted. Her marriage was officially over. After 20 years, she was single again. She thought about Daniel, about the young officer she had fallen in love with so long ago. He had been charming and brave, full of dreams about exploring the galaxy. She had been a promising young scientist, eager to make discoveries that would change the world. They had been so hopeful, so certain that their love could survive anything. But somewhere along the way they had lost each other. Catherine had to admit, at least to herself, that Judge Morris was right. She had prioritized her career over her marriage. She had told herself that Daniel understood, that he supported her ambitions. But had she ever really asked him how he felt? Had she ever really listened? Catherine stood up. She thanked Gregory for his work and told him she needed some time alone. Gregory understood. He gathered his materials and left. Catherine walked to the large windows that overlooked the city. The purple sky was clear, and the twin moons of New Avalon were visible even in daylight. She had lived here for 15 years, had built a life here, had made discoveries here that would outlive her, but now it all felt hollow. What good were scientific achievements if she had no one to share them with? What good was fame if she came home to an empty apartment every night? She thought about Lyra. Catherine had wanted to hate the Velocian woman. It would have been easy to blame her for everything. But after hearing Lyra's testimony, Catherine found it difficult to maintain that anger. Lyra had genuinely believed that her relationship with Daniel was acceptable. She'd even tried to reach out to find a peaceful solution. Catherine had rejected that attempt without really considering it. Maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe if she had been willing to talk, to understand, things could have been different. Or maybe not. Catherine was not sure she could ever truly accept the idea of sharing Daniel with someone else. It went against everything she had been taught about love and commitment. On the other side of the courtroom, Daniel and Lyra prepared to leave. Patricia Cole congratulated Daniel on the outcome. She reminded him that he needed to complete the counseling requirement and stay out of trouble for the next 6 months. Daniel agreed. He looked tired but also relieved. The uncertainty was over. He was legally free to be with Lyra without the weight of a failing marriage hanging over him. But he felt no joy. The trial had forced him to confront his own failures. He had hurt Catherine deeply. He had betrayed vows that he had once believed were sacred. The fact that the marriage was already failing did not erase his responsibility. Daniel looked at Lyra. She stood beside him, her crystalline eyes watching Catherine across the room. Daniel asked Lyra what she was thinking. Lyra said that she felt sad for Catherine. She understood now, better than before, what human marriage meant. She understood the depth of the betrayal Catherine had experienced. Lyra said that if she could go back in time, she would have insisted that Daniel resolve his marriage before beginning a relationship with her. She would have waited. But time only moved forward, and all they could do now was try to be better. Daniel agreed. He said that the counseling would be good for both of them. He needed to understand Velocian culture better if they were going to build a life together, and Lyra needed to understand human emotions and values if she planned to continue living among humans. They left the courtroom together, hand in hand, walking into an uncertain future. In her chambers, Judge Helen Morris sat at her desk and reviewed the final documents. The verdict was recorded, the settlement was documented, and the counseling requirements were formalized. She felt satisfied with her decision. It had not been easy, and she knew it would be controversial. But she believed it was the right choice. This case was bigger than 3 individuals. It was about how humanity would handle the complexities of living in a multi-species society. It was about creating systems that promoted understanding rather than conflict. Morris accessed her communication channel to the Galactic Coalition Council. She submitted her formal recommendation regarding mandatory disclosure and mediation for interspecies relationships involving married individuals. She included a detailed report on the case, explaining her reasoning and the evidence that had informed her decision. She knew the council would debate the recommendation for months, possibly years, but eventually, she believed they would adopt something similar. The need was too great to ignore. As Morris finalized her work, she received a message. It was from the Velocian ambassador to New Avalon. The message thanked her for her fair treatment of Lyra and expressed hope that the case would lead to better understanding between humans and Velocians. Morris replied with a polite acknowledgement. She then received another message, this one from the Human Colonial Authority. They expressed concern about the precedent she had set and requested a meeting to discuss the implications. Morris sighed. The political fallout was beginning. She scheduled the meeting for the following week. 3 months passed. Daniel, Catherine, and Lyra all attended their counseling sessions as required. The sessions were difficult but enlightening. Catherine learned about Velocian culture, about their concept of soul bonds and non-exclusive relationships. She began to understand that Lyra had not been trying to steal her husband. Lyra had simply loved him in the way her culture taught her to love. That understanding did not erase Catherine's pain, but it made it easier to process. Daniel learned to navigate the complexities of being in a relationship with someone from a different species. He studied Velocian customs, language, and values. He realized how much he had taken for granted in his relationship with Lyra. He also learned to recognize the warning signs of a failing relationship so that he would never let things deteriorate the way they had with Catherine. Lyra learned about human emotions, particularly the human concept of romantic exclusivity and the pain that came from betrayal. She began to understand why Catherine had been so devastated. She also learned how to communicate more effectively with humans, how to recognize when cultural differences were causing misunderstandings. The counselor assigned to Lyra was excellent, patient, and knowledgeable about both human and Velocian perspectives. After 6 months, all three completed their counseling. The final settlement was executed. Catherine received her share of the property. Daniel moved out of their shared home and into a new apartment with Lyra. The divorce was fully finalized. Catherine threw herself back into her work with renewed energy. She accepted a position on a new research expedition to study alien ecosystems on unexplored worlds. The expedition would last 3 years. Catherine welcomed the distraction and the opportunity to make new discoveries. Daniel retired from active military service. He had served for 30 years and had earned his rest. He accepted a position teaching military strategy at the Colonial Academy on New Avalon. It was less glamorous than commanding fleets, but it allowed him to stay in one place and build a stable life with Lyra. They married in a ceremony that blended human and Velocian traditions. It was a small private affair with only close friends in attendance. Lyra became an advocate for interspecies cultural education. She worked with the Galactic Coalition to develop training programs for individuals in interspecies relationships. She shared her story, including the painful parts, to help others avoid similar mistakes. She became a respected voice in the movement to create better systems for supporting multi-species families and relationships. 2 years after the trial, the Galactic Coalition Council adopted a modified version of Judge Morris's recommendation. All interspecies relationships involving married individuals now required mandatory disclosure and access to mediation services. The new regulations were not perfect, but they represented progress. Other cases similar to Daniel, Catherine, and Lyra's were handled more smoothly, with less pain and more understanding. 5 years after the trial, Catherine returned to New Avalon for a scientific conference. She had not seen Daniel or Lyra since the divorce was finalized. At the conference, she ran into them unexpectedly. Daniel and Lyra were attending because Lyra was giving a presentation on interspecies cultural communication. There was an awkward moment when they first saw each other. Then Catherine smiled. She walked over and greeted them politely. They talked for a few minutes about their lives, their work, their futures. It was civil, even warm. The wounds had healed, though scars remained.